Hi, everyone. I'm Dario Piselli, Program Manager for the EU Law and Sustainable Development Jean Monnet module, hosted by the University of Siena and co-funded by the European Commission under the Erasmus Plus program from 2017 to 2020. This is the 5th webinar of our EU Law for Sustainable Development webinar series and the first one of 2019. This is why we are particularly excited to have our speaker today, Marianne Kettunen from the Institute for European Environmental Policies, where she's head of Global Challenges and SDGs, of the program on Global Challenges and SDGs. It's an incredible opportunity to take stock of where we are with respect to SDG implementation in the EU, and of course to assess especially the reflection paper that the European Commission just released, laying out the strategies and the vision for getting there and implementing the SDGs. I will now give the floor to Professor Riccardo Pavoni, who will provide a short introduction to our speaker before we leave the floor to Marianne for her presentation. At the end, of course, there will be space for questions. Feel free to type them in the chat that you see on the right of your YouTube page. Riccardo.
This is just a couple of words because I don't want to steal any time from our guest. And just a couple of words to say that we are very grateful to Marianne Kettunen for accepting our invitation to speak on such a timely topic that is the European Commission's January reflection paper entitled Towards a Sustainable Europe by 2030. And as Dario Piselli has already said, this is supposed to be a key policy document emanating from the European Commission, outlining the next steps in the European Union towards implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. On the other hand, I want to stress that this is not the first time that our Jean Monnet module on European Union law and sustainable development is collaborating with the Institute for European Environmental Policy. This is the second time. Last year we had as a guest Faustine Bade-Fossé on the reform of the EU agricultural policy, and that was a very interesting and useful webinar, and I trust that this will be the same. So we are very grateful to Marianne, but we are also very grateful to the Institute for collaborating with us, and we do hope that we will have further chances in the future. You already said basic things about Marianne. Marianne has joined the Institute for European Environmental Policy in 2005, and she's currently heading one of the key programs of the Institute, that is the program on global challenges and indeed the sustainable development goals. She has an expertise especially on biodiversity issues, if I well understand, and she has worked a lot on many aspects and issues relating to biodiversity law and policy. And so thanks again, Marianne, for being with us, and we give you the floor.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you today online. And then I'm just looking at starting to share my screen so that you can see my screen. Riccardo and Dario, can you confirm you can see my screen?
I cannot see your screen.
We are waiting. Probably it should.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let me just see. You're presenting to everybody there. It sort of says on my screen that I'm presenting to everyone.
Yes. I gave you the presentation, so you should just click on the green button on the top left, screen share.
Yes, great. Super. Thank you so much. There we go. Let's click share. Can you confirm when you can see it?
Just takes a moment. Okay, now we are seeing it, and
we
then
can see it.
And here's the presentation.
Perfect.
Super.
Now we're talking. So super. So go back to my thank you. So thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to spend the afternoon with you two, and also the people online to talk about EU and the SDGs. So without any further ado, let's reflect Sustainable Europe by 2030, and let's particularly reflect the EU's reflection paper that came out end of January this year. So what I would want to do with my presentation is firstly, briefly look at and recap what is the EU's role when it comes to implementing SDGs in Europe and globally. Then let's look at what those possible visions for the EU were that were put forward by the Commission in the reflection paper. So we'll have them in mind as we go forward with the presentation. And then I would like to move forward reflecting some of those key policy aspects that the reflection paper put forward. We can't cover all of them in the space and time we have available today, but I'll pick up a few key ones that I think we should focus on. And what I'll do is I'll look at what the reflection paper said, then I'll also look at briefly what we as IEP, as Policy Analysts Institute working on these issues, thought about them. And then I also try to look a little bit towards the future, what is happening and what that tells us in terms of the potential for the EU to basically implement the SDGs in certain policy realms. Then I want to end with a few words regarding monitoring EU's progress, because that is very important. We can't really do anything in an informed manner unless we properly monitor things. And then a few words as conclusion and also next steps. And then I've also provided a further reading list at the end of the presentation for those who want to dwell deeper into the different topics afterwards. So let's recap. What is EU's role when it comes to Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals? It's good to remember that, strictly speaking, implementing Agenda 2030 is the responsibility of UN member states. And that means in the EU, it's the responsibility of the individual EU member states. So that is, strictly speaking, that's how things are. But as we all know, in the EU, policies are implemented together jointly by the EU and its member states. And there are a number of SDGs that can be only addressed through joint policies by the EU and member states. So, for example, if we think about the SDG that is focusing on sustainable production and consumption, SDG was it 12, there is a whole package from the EU level regarding circular economy at the moment that member states need to look into and take account of. Same applies to agriculture policy, same applies to fisheries, also same applies to biodiversity. So basically, that means that taking responsibility at the EU level is simply required. And that's why, and that's how EU enters into the realm of having to do something with the SDGs and Agenda 2030. So that also means that both the EU institutions themselves, but also individual member states or member state coalitions shape the different ambition as regards to the SDG implementation and delivery. So there are different players that can take a different role on different policy areas and be promoters for the change. It can be also recapped in a way that, in the past, EU played a very active role when it came to the Agenda 2030 negotiations. It's acknowledged by many that EU was one of the driving forces to get us there, get us to the agenda itself. But then it's also agreed by many that since that, EU has somewhat dragged its feet politically, particularly. It has focused more on looking at how to develop the framework to assess those goals together with the Eurostat. But up until the moment that we got the reflection paper a couple of months ago, people were disappointed as regards to the political development and push from the EU side and leadership from the EU side to develop to implement the agenda. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. So we now have that paper from the Commission that sets out the ideas what the EU should do and sets out the EU's vision for the SDG implementation for the future. So let's refresh our memory as to what does the paper say and what does the paper contain. So the paper puts forward 4 what it calls policy foundations for sustainable Europe. What it means is simply the key policy areas that the Commission has identified that would be forming the bedrock for EU's shift to a more sustainable future by 2030. And those include shifting towards circular economy, shifting towards more sustainable agriculture, but also broader food policy, shifting towards carbon neutral energy, particularly looking at buildings and mobility and carbon neutralizing buildings and mobility sectors. And then finally, as a fourth element, ensuring that this transition is socially fair across different groups of people in EU. Really importantly, the paper also looks at a number of horizontal enablers, as it calls them. So basically horizontal areas which need to be in place supporting different sectors to switch towards sustainability. So one of them is education, science, technology. Other one is understandably finance and getting the price signals right. Third one looks at how we can bring in business sector to support the shift to sustainability. Fourth one looks into EU trade. And the fifth one is more generically about the governance and ensuring good governance for SDGs in the future. And then as an element, the EU also, the Commission in this paper looks at what is the role that EU should play globally vis-a-vis implementing the SDGs and put some ideas forward in that regard as well. So basically the paper covers EU's shift towards more sustainable future internally, but also EU's role in the globe as well. So EU Commission in the paper puts forward 3 scenarios for future approach that the EU can take. And they sort of vary as regards to their ambition and scope. So the first scenario put forward is developing overarching sustainable development strategy for the EU and its member state. And one thing that this would contain would be what they call a European process for SDG policy coordination. So here we talk about EU member states in a coordinated manner, taking forward SDGs as an overarching agenda for all policy areas, and also putting in place a process to really monitor and coordinate how this is done across the EU, also its member states. The second scenario put forward is that the EU would continue mainstreaming the SDGs across all the EU level policies, but it would not in any way enforce or meddle with the member states' action. So the member states would then themselves separately be more responsible for their own implementation. In this particular scenario, what it means in practice is that the EU's influence towards the member states would come through the EU level policies and policy SDG mainstreaming across EU policies, like again, agriculture or and the third scenario is that the EU would implement the SDGs mainly as part of EU's external policy. And this is pretty much how the Millennium Development Goals were perceived in the past, which were very much considered as a part of development policy rather than part of also something that EU internally in its own policies would need to take up as well. So these are the 3 different scenarios put forward in the paper. And what I'm asking you to think about is, what do you think that the EU should do? And what do you think that the pros and cons of different approaches would be while you listen through this webinar? And then you can maybe share your views at the end of it as well. But with that, moving on to looking at different policy foundations that the Commission puts forward in this paper. So I picked up first the circular economy. So in the reflection paper, the Commission highlights that circular economy is the backbone of, or needs to be the backbone of the EU industrial strategy. And there needs to be push towards circularity in new areas and new sectors in the EU. It notes, on the one hand, that it's really needed that we shift to more circular economy and more circular use of resources, because basically, if you look at the trends as they are at the moment, there will just not be enough resources to go around in the globe or in the EU in the future. So that is what the first graph here tells us. In addition, the paper also recognizes that if we shift to circular economy, it actually has a potential to provide economic benefits, and increase and bring in jobs as well for the EU. So it is a positive. It can be a very positive drive for the economy in the EU as well. And it also notes that there are positive trends already in place in the EU. So the use of circular material is increasing in the EU steadily over the past decade. So that is what the policy paper says and highlights. And then when we look at the policy paper as policy analysts, we picked up a number of things we thought was really good, and also a number of things we thought, where the vision here regards circular economy was lacking. So first and foremost, what we thought was very good in the Commission's vision was that it focused on the implementation of existing policies. So we know that the circular economy package is now there. It's going through the policy process, so we really need to be making sure that it gets properly implemented. What we know about the EU policies which have been there in the past is that often the policies themselves are relatively good and fit for purpose, but it is the implementation where everything either makes it or breaks it, where things might fall apart. So focusing on implementation, therefore, in a vision is a good thing. And the paper also provides a number of horizontal enablers, as it calls it. So, for example, environmental taxation, or talking about blockchain technology as an enabling factor that needs to be put in place to support the circular economy. And also, what is good about it is the recognition of circular bioeconomy, including need to protect ecosystems and avoid overexploitation of natural resources as well. Before I continue, can I get quickly a confirmation from Dario or Ricardo that you can actually hear me? Because somehow the voice quality changed, and I'm wondering whether you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you well, Marianne. And just a brief note to Professor Pavoni. I just muted him because of sort of limiting the background noise. So I'm just asking him when he's going to intervene at the end of your presentation to remember to turn on the microphone by clicking on top of the screen. But yes, we're hearing you, Marianne.
Super.
I can hear you. I can also hear you very well.
Super. And I think that must have been it, because basically, Dario, you switched off the microphone, so the sound disappeared, and I was worried that you were kicking me out of the webinar. So I was talking to myself. But super. So we're still online. So basically, two positive things that we picked up when it was regards to circular economy and EU's Commission's reflection paper. But then we also picked up a few things which we thought that this is where the paper falls short. So those were linked to providing a vision for where the funding for the shift to a circular economy would come from. And that is really crucial for the implementation. Again, looking at policies in the past, what we know is that when implementation is lacking, it is often because there is not enough funding, clear support from the funding sources, EU and others as well, to basically enable a shift towards the policy implementation. And the second thing we picked up was a lack of concrete measures linking circular economy to sustainable consumption. So one can do only so much on the side of production and circularity of the production. It needs to be always accompanied with measures linked to sustainable consumption as well, either incentivizing the consumer side or even perhaps regulating the consumer side as well. So those were our quick pros and cons when looking at the EU's reflection paper itself. But then, of course, it's interesting to ask yourselves, right, what do we know about where the policy process is currently going when it comes to circular economy? Because that is what tells you whether there is a chance for the EU, or whether the EU is on the right track to be able to deliver its vision in this paper. So what we're looking at for different policy sectors, we're looking towards the future. We are looking towards signs of progress at the moment, and we're looking at signs of political will that can give us an indication whether EU is likely to succeed or not. And when it comes to the circular economy, I have the feeling that we can be relatively positive there. So we know that the single-use plastic element, for example, of the plastic circular economy package has been picked up. It's going forward. EU has agreed on it. Basically, a few days ago, it was agreed at the Parliament level to adopt the new rules on single-use plastic. to reduce milliliter. So in that respect, when we look at the circular economy and EU's track record and future developments of that, I feel that we can be relatively positive where we're going, and perhaps we certainly are on the right track there. But then moving on to looking at agriculture and food. The EU's reflection paper here, it recognizes that we need a more comprehensive approach towards sustainable food systems. And that is very good and positive. It already highlights that there are positive trends happening in Europe. For example, highlighting the organic agriculture has been increasing over a decade, very steadily in the EU. And it also here as well highlights that, if we shift towards sustainable food systems in line with the SDG delivery, it can create new economic value for Globe and for EU as well. When we looked at this element of the reflection paper with IEP colleagues, we felt that it was certainly positive how agriculture was very much highlighted that as an element that delivers EU's climate environmental goals more broadly as well. So making the link between agriculture and its impacts on the climate goals and also broader environmental goals and SDGs. And the paper also, it acknowledged that there is a need to change EU's consumption patterns. So not including only what we consume, but also how we consume. And that recognition itself was very positive. However, we then felt that the paper failed to provide a more concrete vision and measures to how we would change this consumption in the EU. So it kind of fell short on providing something more concrete as to how to tackle the consumption side of things. And also the paper, it had a very high reliance on the political will that we will be further reforming the common agriculture policy and greening the CAP. And if we here start to look towards the future and think about, can we see some signs of a political will or progress? Looking at the CAP, if anybody picked it up, but it was a couple of days ago at the European Parliament Agriculture Committee discussed and voted about the future CAP, and it seems to be that sadly, their stance on it was not as green as was hoped for. So based on the European Parliament and their committee reflections, it seems to be that the political will is lacking. And I think that's agreed by many at this stage. Then looking at the consumption side, that's also, it's important because if you don't provide a vision for consumption, that is where you start to fail in terms of delivering a more sustainable food system in the future. And let me provide you a concrete example on that, looking at the agriculture's role in delivering EU's climate goals. So recently, we at IEP put out a new report where we looked at whether the net zero future is possible for EU agriculture sector. And what the net zero future means is basically climate neutral future for EU agriculture sector. At the moment, the agriculture sector has been looking at 3 different means to reduce its carbon footprint. So it's been looking at either increasing its efficiency of production vis-a-vis greenhouse gas emissions. It's been looking at changing what commodities are produced, or increasing its ability to sequester carbon through the land use itself. So those are the means that have been looked at and have been identified as means to bring down the carbon footprint of EU's agriculture sector from the production side. But what our report highlighted was that on their own, none of these measures can deliver the mitigation level that is necessary for net zero future. And even when they are used together, they can only lead to emission reduction of so far. So basically what we concluded was that there are further steps required, and those further steps are very much linked to not only what you can do in the production side inside agriculture, but also what you can do outside the agriculture sector, particularly linked to consumption. So because of this, for example, it's really important that EU in the future would look at the consumption side of it, and that is what the reflection paper was still missing in more detail. Moving on to energy and climate. So what is positive and good about the paper and what the reflection paper says is that there is a need to be doing more to live up to the letter as well as the spirit of the Paris Agreement. It notes that there are positive trends, for example, linked to renewable energy in the EU and renewable energy use, and particularly, for example, the use of renewable energy in the transport sector. So trends are positive in many cases. So indeed, looking at to increase the EU ambition beyond 2030 to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement is very good about the vision. Also, it's good that the paper acknowledges that there's progress yet needed to further decarbonize the building sector. And it's also good that when looking at the transport, it's acknowledged that there is a need for a full life cycle view of the battery and also vehicle production as well. So looking at it more broadly than simply of the emissions. But we did feel that the paper was ever so slightly too positive when it came to the progress of, in general, decoupling emissions from economic growth and the emission reduction to date. And also there seemed to be limited emphasis on the social implications of sustainable transport. So, for example, health impacts, impacts of fuel taxation vis-a-vis different groups of society, and access to transport by different groups of society as well. So that was limitedly looked at in the paper. When looking at those signs of political will and signs of progress in the future, what will be important to follow, I think, is the EU's long-term strategy for climate neutral Europe by 2050. So that came out end of last year and is now going through the discussions. It has a number of positive elements. For example, it looks at nearly all the EU policies that are linked to climate. So not only energy policy, but also more broadly policy sectors. So that sort of, cross-sectoral role, a cross-sectoral approach is very much welcomed. And it also sort of, keeps on sort of, highlighting that, pursuing efforts to keep it to keep the level of temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius is important. However, and now we also look at, again, the current signs of current political will to take this forward. It seems to be that just recently, the European Council conclusions on climate change that were adopted seem to, if nothing else, they seem to be slightly giving the sign that the political will perhaps isn't quite there where we would hope it to be. So the Council conclusions, they don't highlight enough the scale of which we need to scale up the EU emissions cuts by 2030, and they also don't give a date to achieve climate neutrality. And for example, the coalition of the high ambition countries, including some Nordic countries, France, Luxembourg, and so forth, their position was not included in the final text, it seems, as well. So as I said, between the countries in the EU, when it comes to climate, seems to be that some push is still further needed to get us there by 2030. Finally, looking at EU as a global leader as one of the key elements of the paper. The reflection paper identifies that it is in the EU's interest to play a leading role in implementation of the agenda globally through its external action. It identifies that the EU has a big potential to do so. EU is the greatest provider of official development aid in the globe. So that is a very strong avenue through which EU, via dialogue and diplomacy, can influence world to shift towards sustainable means. Also, the paper acknowledges that EU is one of the biggest traders of the world. And part of the EU trade agreements since 2010, there have been explicit provisions promoting trade and sustainable development, or sustainable development in the context of trade. And basically last year, so about a year ago, EU has put forward a 15-point action plan which aims to improve the implementation and enforcement of these sustainable development provisions in trade, because it's also been acknowledged that these provisions have not been picked up or are not delivering as well as they could or should be. So what we thought was very good at the paper was that there was a focus on implementing EU policy coherence for SDGs. So basically making sure that different EU policies are in sync when it comes to delivering SDGs and sustainability. And it did not only look at the EU external policies in this context, but it also identified that EU's internal policies have external implications. So, for example, what EU does with its agriculture policy has an implication through trade to the world, or what EU does with its energy policy similarly has an implication to the world through trade as well. And interestingly, it also highlighted the EU's paper the possibility of EU initiating a binding global agreement on circular economy or resource use or biodiversity, without any further details, but simply opening a door for something similar on the global level. The things that we felt that were missing were, even though the paper talked about EU and EU's role in climate security and environmental security, it could have been much more conflict prevention oriented, identifying, for example, the role of environmental and ecosystem protection and restoration in conflict prevention. It could have been much more much more concrete in terms of identifying what the EU trade agreements and the sustainable development chapters could do in the future. It simply says that they need to be more assertive, but it did left it open in which way. And finally, and truly importantly, and this goes through all the paper, whether global or EU-related actions, there was a lack of acknowledgement that biodiversity and ecosystem services can be a concrete policy solution towards the delivery of SDGs. The paper very clearly and very aptly identifies that biodiversity and ecosystems are a threat, and therefore we need urgent action. But then it fails to pick up the opportunity what these elements, ecosystem services, for example, can provide as to solutions to deliver sustainable development goals as well. So when we then look at the policy coherence and sustainable development more detailedly and look at the signs in the future, how things are going, I want to pick up one thing, and that is the EU spillover effects. So at the moment, EU and the Eurostat is not actually looking at in detail how its internal policies impact the world. However, the information that comes from the international side, so from the report by Sustainable Development Solutions Network and their dashboard report for the globe, has identified that a number of EU countries are among the 10 worst countries when it comes to importing. Through their imports, they are exporting their biodiversity or emissions footprint. So, for example, through trade, EU is successfully exporting its footprint on biodiversity elsewhere. And that is something that is a big gap, we think, when it comes to how EU is currently looking at and measuring its delivery of sustainable development goals. It is not looking at its footprint on the globe as well as and as much as it should be. And that kind of brings me more towards the end of my webinar and highlighting the importance of measuring what we manage and assessing and monitoring EU progress as a whole, beyond the footprint issues as well. So we indeed have a monitoring annually by Eurostat, which is great. The latest monitoring report came at the end of 2018. It seems that we are in many ways on the track when it comes to making good progress towards those goals. But it's also identified that we still lack a robust methodology to assess progress against set goals, not simply the trends in a way. So that is something that we would need to still hopefully look at the EU level to make sure that we are not only looking at trends, but we actually have an end goal we want to match and we can map ourselves towards it. And that requires policy targets. And that's again where the reflection paper comes into play. So ambitious reflection paper and pick up of the ambitious vision of the reflection paper will allow, hopefully, to establish more explicit goals for different policy areas, more than we have at the moment. And finally, looking at the future, of course, it's really important to ask ourselves, right, what will the European parliamentary elections in May have in store? So IEP has identified a range of the available manifestos of the European parties available. So you can take a look at the website and see what they say about sustainable development and different elements of policy sectors. It seems that based on our analysis, none of the current manifestos are perfect. For example, European Left has really good elements in a number of sustainability areas, but it doesn't refer to SDGs or Paris Agreement explicitly. Socialist Party, again, number of elements there, but for example, what is lacking is biodiversity and recognition of biodiversity in the context of sustainability. So take a look at these ones if you want from our website to get a further idea as to what is in store for Europe in the future. Finally, conclusions and next steps. So the Commission's reflection paper, in our view, it has a number of good and promising elements, but indeed, some say that it's too little concrete commitment too late. It was, long waited for it to come out, and now, of course, now it's sort of, is very much in the hands of the upcoming Parliament and the upcoming Commission what will happen. And all also depends on what will be implemented, scenario 1, 2, or 3, and what the future for that decides. So it will indeed be particularly debated after the new parliamentary elections have been in place and what happens next, and who gets the final say at the Commission as well. So with that, I say thank you, and hopefully we can move on to having some interesting discussions around the reflection paper next.
Super. Thank you, Marianne. It was a very effective presentation. Lots of food for thought, hopefully, for our viewers. And maybe we want to start. I just emphasized on the YouTube page that people can start typing their questions. But maybe if we want to start sort of breaking the ice with Professor Pavoni in case he has any question to start. And I have a couple myself, actually more than a couple, but we'll try to keep it short. Riccardo, okay, now you have the microphone on. Go on.
Well, just a very brief reaction. First of all, thank you so much for being so effective and short. Sometimes people are tending to speak too much on these topics without effective points, and I think that this was not your case at all. You've been very clear in describing the paper, the European Commission paper, and also what the main reactions by the Institute for European Environmental Policy are and where. With respect to the 3 scenarios, just a brief reaction on that. Then maybe I may come back later on other points. I do share, of course, this is very trivial to say, but the next European elections will be key to the choice of the best vision for Europe relating to the implementation of the SDGs. Because I think that if you ask 90% of the people, at least people who care about the environment and about our future, they would say that the first scenario is by far the best, because Europe, indeed, and the European Union has the capacity, the leadership capacity to undertake such a vision. I mean, to say that the SDGs have to be the overarching policy framework, and they also have the legal competence to establish precise measures, precise targets, and to accompany those measures with enforcement actions. This could be done, but of course, what may be lacking is the political will, and the next elections will tell us more about that, and will be key in that respect. The other 2 scenarios are, in my view, belong to the past, and I do share your opinion. For example, the focus on the exclusive focus on the external policy is a kind of new version of the Millennium Development Goals, which doesn't make any sense in present days, and of course, it's also very contradictory in my view, because you cannot focus on external policy without concentrating on the measures needed at the internal level in the EU, especially because, as you said very, very well, very, very clearly, the internal measures have a profound impact on the external measures and on the delivery of the SDGs at the international level. So I think that the third scenario should be discarded. And the second one, mainstreaming, of course, we could go on with that, but it's not satisfactory from the point of view of an effective implementation of the SDGs, because if you don't have precise obligations for member states, that would mean discretion, that would mean freedom for the member states to decide whether to implement or not implement, and to what degree and to what extent. So I do share your perspective, and I wanted to stress my preference for the first scenario, but this may be just a dream if the next elections will be sad for the European Union, because possible outcome is a very sad outcome for the European Union, as everybody knows. So we'll see what happens next May. Yeah.
No, I very much agree. And I said, I think I didn't explicitly state it, during my webinar, but I think it must have been, in the subtext very clearly that, at IEP as well, what we concluded after analysis was that, scenario 1 is by far the best, most coordinated, also because it comes, with a vision for something that will help us to monitor jointly delivery with the member states. Otherwise, we are, as you quite nicely put it, a bit of a stuck in the past, and particularly with the third scenario, which is certainly not going to be delivering sustainability for Europe in any way. And that's the whole point of this particular sustainable development goals versus Millennium Development Goals. It is also as much applicable and relevant for Europe as it is for the world, or Europe towards the world.
Super. I might maybe add one further reflection here, and one question for you, Marianne, because I of course I associate myself with the kind of preference that Professor Pavoni and of course the Institute for European Environmental Policies have expressed for scenario number 1. But I find it quite interesting that one of the cons that the European Commission itself identifies in scenario 1 in the reflection paper is the fact that it will require a lot of institutional machinery to be set up, in terms of, the setting of the goals and the deliverables, specifying, like going from essentially the SDGs and the 2030 agenda to something that's applicable to Europe, and then that's scalable down to the member states as well, including monitoring of progress and so on. And this could be, I guess, they were saying this would take up quite some time, especially as we're already in 2019. And my question would be, do you think that this would be, or I mean, has there been any thoughts on this? How do you think this could be harmonized? For example, the monitoring of progress at the EU level, so that states would be required to do, as opposed to then the voluntary national reviews that then they are supposed to do at the high-level political forum in New York. So it's all quite interesting in terms of harmonizing this system, I think.
I agree with you in terms of the harmonizing is needed. Whether I have, a vision in my mind how that harmonizing should happen, no, I think, and I haven't seen papers on it either. I think it would be quite interesting to do a bit of again, policy scoping exercise as to, what steps to be taken and who takes the lead. Because basically we're talking about here what should, for example, how the European reporting is done by the Eurostat, and also who will be then enforcing the member states' report in a similar manner with their voluntary national reporting. Because if you look at the national reporting at the moment, it's done in a very different ways. So therefore, it's also very difficult for them, from different national reports to pull up something that would allow to compare the member states immediately after you've simply read those reports, and then scale it up to the EU level as well. So I said, I can only say that harmonization is needed. I would certainly, as a steps towards that future framework, which requires both policy goals and the and also measuring them, I would include the measuring and the harmonization of the measurements and measuring systems and frameworks as one of the key elements where we can start. For 2 reasons. I think because lots of measuring is being done at the moment. There's really good things happening there, and also Eurostat is pushing forward improvements every report they put out, there's something that they've done more in detail, in a way better, in my view. So because of that, development are taking place, progress is taking place. So that is a good place where to start. But also, other hand side, I strongly believe that if we don't have a good measuring in place, it's very difficult then to build on informed policies and policy steps on anything. So I said, so therefore getting that synchronized and right might feel trivial, and certainly shouldn't be the only place we try to make progress with, but it's not, in a way that it's a fundamental element upon which you build a good policy framework on top, if that makes sense. So I said, no answers to you, but simply nodding and taking a bit forward as to what needs to be done next and why it is important.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with this. And I was just trying to be provocative and to stimulate the discussion here, because also I'm noticing that our viewers are being a bit shy in terms of typing questions today. So maybe I can jump in with someone with another question, unless Professor Pavoni wants to add something more himself.
No, go ahead.
Okay, super. I wanted to touch briefly on the biodiversity aspect that you mentioned, or the lack thereof. As you emphasized, this seems to be some sort of the elephant in the room, kind of mentioned at the margins in the context of circular economy, or in the context of the farm to fork kind of sustainability vision of the EU, but the lack of emphasis in terms of properly protecting biodiversity and ecosystem services, and also leveraging the synergies that protection of biodiversity has in terms of health, in terms of socio-economic impacts, which could in turn provide an additional motivation for protection. And I'm sort of wondering if you think that this is sort of that follows kind of the conclusion that, for example, the fitness check of European Union biodiversity law, so the Birds and Habitats Directive, which was conducted a couple of years ago, the way that it kind of sees these instruments as still fit for purpose and it's still relevant, despite the fact that we just celebrated basically 40 years from the adoptions of the Birds Directive. And so do you think that this sense of mild, let's say, complacency with the Habitats and Birds Directives and nature conservation legislation is sort of leading the EU here to sort of discount the need to streamline this element more broadly in the other policies? One thing that I was, for example, struck by is the fact that there's no emphasis on land use change when the reflection paper talks about sustainability from farm to fork, for example. And so yeah, I'm just wondering some reflection on this. Do you think that there's a risk of not seeing an update of EU biodiversity law as necessary, despite, of course, the conservation successes?
Yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, you're asking that when we aptly so declared those directives fit for purpose, that sort of might have played against us, because it sort of set them in a certain realm, more considered that they are there for protection. And therefore, indeed, because of them, things should be protected, but they can't really play, or they are not foreseen to play a more proactive role, because, of course, those directives were, they were put in place long before we even were talking about ecosystem services in a policy level. We talk about 40 years with those directives. Yeah. That's an interesting thought, and I haven't really thought about it from that perspective. Whether if we would renew them, it would be like a marketing exercise, and whether for that marketing exercise we would actually need to to renew them, open them up. That certainly is not it's certainly not the way that ourselves and other experts look at it in a way. We have seen that there's opening up the directives, as it were, the discussion at the time would have opened up a number of risks more than it would have opened up opportunities. And personally, I still stand behind that, and I reckon a number of experts would say the same. And I would also emphasize that there has been a lot of how would I say marketing exercise to basically show how those directives and EU biodiversity policy more broadly can deliver proactively for a number of sustainability elements through ecosystem services, for example. Why that hasn't broken itself through, to to the levels of, like these reflection papers. It kind of gets to a certain level in a policy dialogue, but not to the level of this such a high level reflection paper, then clearly also stating that yes, we need to protect these, and we need to protect these because they can, for example, provide solutions through nature-based solutions, green infrastructure for delivering more sustainable agriculture. That still baffles me, because I find that the evidence is there, and the only thing I can think of is that perhaps they can only be, so you take a high level paper like this, and they can perhaps only be 4 things you can put out as the key your key policy change elements, and therefore something needs to fall out. And sadly, it's still often it is biodiversity that falls out, and I don't know, then it shouldn't. I would like to argue that there could have been a 5th one, or at least you could still have those 4 elements there. Biodiversity much better integrated into those 4 elements as a solution, not only as something that is impacted on by agriculture, for example. But I said, that is something that still baffles me. And anybody has an idea why we haven't been able to make a breakthrough with this new thinking, building on those old instruments which are still fit for purpose, also deliver this more novel solution-oriented vision. Please tell me, and I'll be delighted and hoping to be able to make a progress to improve it as a policy analyst.
Thanks so much. I think it's this is what kind of was aiming at. It's quite interesting in a way that despite the successes, we've had a very different approach taken with respect to, for example, to marine and aquatic environments, right? Yeah. With a more holistic approach that perhaps need to somehow creep in the direct Birds and Habitat Directive as well, for example. Yeah. But yeah, time will tell, essentially, yeah. And it's great at least to have this discussion and to have here and there these elements pop up. Yeah. Professor Pavoni.
No, I was thinking about, you mentioned oceans, the protection of oceans, or the protection of marine life, I well understood in your last part. And I was thinking back when the first part of Marianne's presentation, when she underlined what the EU has to do with this. And she underlined very well that the EU, of course, has many competencies in these areas. And as regards ocean and so SDGs 14, I realized from this paper that this is one of the main problems as regards implementation. We are far behind the targets relating to SDG 14 on life below water. And I want to stress that in that area, the EU has an exclusive competence. So the member states cannot just take measures in the area of the protection of the oceans and the conservation of marine biological resources. So if you just take the key example, of course the EU has a crucial role to play here. And if we want to go back to what I said before, is that of course the preference for scenario 1 also derives from the fact that integration between the goals, among the goals, is the key, as we know, and it's also a key component of the principle of sustainable development. It's impossible to think in terms of sustainable development without thinking in terms of the integral nature of all the goals and all the components of the sustainable development. So, I mean, a very fragmented action does not make much sense to me in this area. I would have a last question, if I can, for Marianne. I'm very curious here. I just wonder whether you have any thought, also very, very simple thoughts, on the impact of Brexit on all this. If the Brexit has anything to say in this respect, if anything can change with respect of our assessment of this paper. To me, it makes a difference because the UK is a major economy, is a major country. So, if Brexit occurs, indeed, there would be a major impact on the future of the strategy of the Commission in this area. But that's just a random thought. But maybe you know more than me here. I don't know if you have an idea.
You know, when it comes to Brexit, for the viewers, you know, who perhaps don't know, so IEP has main office in Brussels and then another office in London. So, you know, we're very much aware, and also I'm based in the London, in the UK, I'm part of the London office. And the first thing to say, of course, you know, at the moment, who knows what is going to happen? It is, you know, every day is a new day, it seems. So, but more fundamentally, to your point, yes, UK leaving has impacts on how EU as an economy will be dealing with. I don't have an sort of an insight as to how big of a change that will be in terms of, you know, the economic well-being of the EU. So we'll not comment on that, but that is sort of, you know, the fundamental element, as you point out, that, you know, will impact, you know, what kind of policies EU and the EU countries will be willing to do, because, you know, if they feel that, you know, there is insecurity as towards, you know, the economic security. So what will happen remains to be seen. How big of the impact is will certainly have an impact on this. But then if we look at the different policy areas, and that's sort of, you know, where things, you know, where somebody like me can see more clearly what the impact might be. When I look at the biodiversity policy, which, as you said, you know, has been my expertise very much in the past, I've also seen that in a number of cases, UK has been a forerunner pushing certain things forward. If you, for example, take invasive alien species, you know, which is one of the recent successes of the EU law, Great Britain was one of the key member states being very progressive about it and bringing it forward on the agenda at the EU level. So from that context, you know, I feel that, you know, certainly we will miss the Great Britain when Brexit happens. Then if we look at trade, for example, that would be interesting because, you know, then of course, when Brexit happens, you know, it's still no when and if, you know, don't even know which pronoun I should use here. That means that the EU will be negotiating a trade agreement with the UK. And of course, that then, you know, what kind of sustainable development related sustainability chapters will be built into that agreement can be certainly set a precedence for the future agreements as well. So that, again, if we want to look at the silver lining or an opportunity here, depending, that's, you know, could be one of those in a way. So sectorally, it's, you know, we can see more clearly where and what the impacts might be, or what kind of opportunities / negative impacts it might have as well. So I guess I would look at it on a layered manner as a whole for the economy, but then also more sectorally what happens.
Super. Thank you, and thanks also for sort of tackling headfirst which another elephant in the room, let's say, in this case. But yeah, I think we are running to the end of like the hour that we usually allocate for the webinar. So maybe some closing point, Professor Pavoni, or otherwise, because I see there are still no questions. So we hope that we have managed to entertain the viewers with our own sort of self-referential conversation. And but yeah, anything to add, Professor, or Marianne as well, of course.
No, the webinar is, I mean, will remain online, so it will be available to anybody who is interested in hearing the interesting thoughts by Marianne, and so I think that that's a service also for the future. I mean, it's a sustainable addition to our materials. So no, just a closing word to say thank you again to Marianne. I think this has been very, very helpful to us also to learn more, to understand and to have more perspectives on this emerging area and this continuously changing area of EU law and policy. I think what we all understood is that this is a key area that cannot be left out of any policy or legal discussion about the future of the EU. I think that's for sure. So thanks again, Marianne. I don't know if you have anything to say as last words.
No, From my side, I also want to say thank you, anybody who was listening or will be listening in the future, and also, of course, to you, Daria and Ricardo, for the invitation and a nice chat in the afternoon towards the end of the week. It's been a great pleasure, and I do hope that we continue indeed cooperating also in the future. And if anybody has any comments, you know where IEEP is. You can find us on Twitter. So do get in touch as well.
Absolutely. I didn't make the point in the YouTube chat, but the follow-up questions super welcomed as well, as I'm sure there will be. And nothing to say more apart from, of course, some thanks to Marianne from my end as well, and reminding everyone that the next webinar of this 2019 series is going to take place on the 26th of April. With Gabriela Oanta from the University of La Coruña, and we will be talking with her about EU Fisheries Partnership Agreement and Sustainable Development. So quite another interesting topic, expanding on what we have been discussing today. So yes, thanks again, and hopefully we'll be connecting soon with the EU Law and Sustainable Development Project, especially since I just want to maybe say this last thing, since this is a particularly important year for Jean Monnet modules. It's the 30th anniversary and of the Jean Monnet program of funding. So we are really happy to be able to continue this discussion in the context of sustainable development with organizations like the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Thanks again, and have a nice afternoon, everyone, or evening or morning from wherever you have connected. That's the good thing of webinars. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.